Welcome, and thank you for joining us for this custom-tailored deep dive. We've designed this incredibly massive exploration specifically for you, and we're going to be jumping right into a towering stack of source material today to extract the really foundational insights.
We really are. It is a literal mountain of documents.
Yeah, it's huge. Today, our mission is a comprehensive, walls-down exploration of Karl Marx's socioeconomic theory, his life, and his sprawling, often highly controversial historical legacy.
And when you say a mountain of material, you aren't kidding. We're pulling from detailed biographical texts on his day-to-day life, historical encyclopedias covering the intense political battles of the First International, foundational texts on historical materialism, and some really contemporary academic analyses examining his relevance right now in the 21st century.
Right, including those incredibly deep chapter-by-chapter breakdowns of his magnum opus, Das Kapital.
It's a massive undertaking. The goal today is to cut through that incredibly dense academic jargon that usually surrounds this topic. We want to bypass the heavy political rhetoric and just extract the core mechanics of his thought.
Look under the hood, basically.
Exactly. Look under the hood of his philosophy to understand exactly how he argued human society functions, from the macro level of global history down to the micro level of a single worker on a factory floor.
And just as a quick reminder to you listening, because we know anything with the word Marx or communism in it can start a screaming match at a Thanksgiving dinner. Our job today isn't to take a side.
I need to explicitly jump in and emphasize that, because the sources contain highly politically charged content spanning from capitalism to communism, left-wing to right-wing critiques. We have to make it absolutely clear that we are not endorsing any of these political viewpoints.
No, not at all.
Our goal is strictly impartial. We are here to objectively report and convey the factual ideas, theories, and historical events exactly as they are contained in the original source material. That's the only way to genuinely understand the architecture of these arguments.
Perfectly said. We're just looking at the blueprints. So you might be asking yourself right now, why should you care about a 19th century economic theory? Why spend all this time dissecting the writings of a Victorian-era philosopher with a massive beard?
It's a fair question.
Right. But the answer is that whether you personally agree with Marx or whether you fundamentally reject every single syllable he ever wrote, his concepts are everywhere around you.
They absolutely are.
Ideas like worker alienation, the impact of technological automation on wages, the structural causes of global financial crises, these are actively shaping modern debates right now.
Yeah, when you open an app to order a gig economy ride, or when you read about environmental sustainability and the limits of global finance, you are stepping into debates that were explicitly framed by this source material over a century and a half ago.
So understanding the architecture of his thought gives you a highly focused lens to comprehend the arguments happening in contemporary society, regardless of where you ultimately stand on them.
But to really grasp the theory, we have to start with the man himself. Karl Marx's theories didn't just fall out of the sky in a vacuum.
No, they've definitely been.
They were deeply, permanently forged by the very specific and often completely tragic material conditions of his own life.
So let's start at the beginning. Karl Marx was born in 1818 in the city of Trier in Prussia, and he was born into a world of profound, violent transition.
Right, the old remnants of European feudalism were actively being dismantled by the explosive rise of early industrial capitalism.
And his family dynamic is really fascinating here. His father, Heinrich Marx, is this incredibly pivotal figure in the story. Heinrich was a liberal lawyer. He loved the Enlightenment thinkers. He was reading people like Immanuel Kant and Voltaire.
But Heinrich was also descended from a long, unbroken line of Jewish rabbis.
Yeah, and this is where the broader historical politics crashed into their personal lives. Under the repressive conservative laws of the Prussian state at the time, Jews were barred from holding certain professional roles.
Right, to maintain his legal career and provide for his family, Heinrich was forced to convert from Judaism to Lutheranism.
That is just a massive psychological weight for a family to carry. Imagine being a kid and watching your father, a respected, educated professional, have to publicly renounce his heritage just to be allowed to practice law.
What's fascinating here is the psychological and philosophical impact that forced conversion likely had on a young Karl Marx.
It had to be huge.
It was. He grew up in a household that outwardly revered those beautiful Enlightenment ideals of liberty, equality, rationality. Yet he saw firsthand through his father's very painful experience the glaring, ugly contradictions between formal, legal freedoms and the harsh material realities of social exclusion.
It planted an early, deep seed of skepticism.
Exactly. It taught him early on that the formal rights granted by a state on a piece of paper could be completely undermined by material and social coercion in the real world.
It's the ultimate lesson in hypocrisy. So with that background, Marx heads off to get his education. He starts at the University of Bonn in 1835, and he's focusing on literature and law.
But he wasn't just sitting quietly in the library.
Definitely not. He was a bit of a rebel. He was deeply involved in tavern clubs. He joined the Poets Club. He was getting into duels, basically getting into the exact kind of trouble you'd expect from a restless, highly intelligent university student who feels constrained by the world around him.
He was definitely living a boisterous life in Bonn. But the intellectual pivot really happens in 1836 when he transfers to the University of Berlin.
And that's where the philosophical fireworks start going off.
Berlin was a much more serious academic environment, and he quickly gets pulled into the orbit of a radical group of young intellectuals known as the Young Hegelians.
Hegel is a name that haunts all of this source material. G.W.F. Hegel had been this towering philosophical figure at the university until his death a few years prior. And from what the sources say, the young Hegelians were taking his complex theories and sort of weaponizing them against the government.
That's a great way to put it. At first, Marx actually resisted Hegel's ideas. He found them too abstract. But he soon became deeply embedded in this circle, which included brilliant, radical figures who were using Hegel's dialectical method to fiercely critique the religious and political establishments of the Prussian state.
They were asking dangerous questions.
Very dangerous. Marx eventually channeled this energy into his doctoral thesis, which was accepted in 1841. He wrote about the materialist philosophies of ancient Greek thinkers.
And the irony is he actually wanted a pretty normal life at this point.
He did.
He wanted a quiet academic career. He wanted to be a professor of philosophy, wear a tweed jacket, and argue about the Greeks. But the conservative Prussian state was terrified of the young Hegelians and started cracking down on radical thinkers.
They blacklisted his mentors, and his academic aspirations were completely crushed. He simply couldn't get a job in the university system.
And that rejection is one of the great turning points in modern history, really. It forced him out of the ivory tower and into the trenches of journalism, which turned out to be the ultimate catalyst for everything that followed.
Exactly. In 1842, he manages to become the editor of a liberal newspaper in Cologne called the Rheinische Zeitung. And this is where the high-minded philosophy brutally meets the pavement of the real world.
Because as an editor, he couldn't just write about the world spirit or ancient Greek atoms anymore. He had to report on actual material, social issues happening to regular people.
And there are two specific events from his time at the paper that the historical sources highlight as absolute paradigm shifts for him.
Right. First, he had to report on the severe, crushing poverty of the Moselle wine growers who were being ruined by free trade policies.
And second, he covered these new, highly controversial laws regarding the gathering of fallen wood in the forests.
I want to spend a second on the wood theft laws, because the details are so incredibly visceral.
They are crucial to understanding his development. For centuries, under common law and traditional feudal arrangements, peasants had the right to go into the forests and gather dead, fallen branches to use for heating and cooking. It was a basic survival right.
But as private property laws became more strictly codified to support early capitalism, the wealthy landowners pushed the state to criminalize this practice. Suddenly, picking up a dead stick was prosecuted as theft.
Just think about the reality of that. You have this brilliant young philosopher, trained to think about the highest ideals of justice and rationality, suddenly having to write articles about freezing peasants being thrown into a dank prison cell for picking up dead branches off the dirt.
It forced him to completely land in pure philosophy.
Yes. He realized he had to grapple with hard material economic issues. He saw that the law wasn't some abstract divine ideal of justice. It was a physical weapon being used to protect the economic interests of the wealthy property owners against the desperately poor.
It shattered his remaining illusions about the neutrality of the state, so he started writing incredibly fiery editorials about this, which, unsurprisingly, led to the newspaper being officially banned by the Prussian authorities in 1843.
Marx was essentially run out of town. He was forced into exile, moving to Paris, which was the vibrant intellectual and political capital of radical Europe at the time.
And Paris is where he meets the other half of this historical duo, Friedrich Engels.
These two become lifelong collaborators, but their backgrounds couldn't be more different.
No, Engels wasn't a starving journalist. He was the son of a very wealthy German textile manufacturer who owned factories in England.
It is a remarkable historical partnership. Engels was able to provide Marx with two things he desperately needed. First, crucial financial backing to keep him alive, and second, raw empirical data.
Right, because Engels had just written a groundbreaking sociological study called The Condition of the Working Class in England.
Exactly. He had been inside his father's factories in Manchester. He had seen the horrific, bone-crushing conditions of the early Industrial Revolution firsthand. He brought that stark reality to Marx's theoretical genius.
But even with Engels' help, the contrast between Marx's towering intellectual legacy and the brutal, tragic reality of his daily life is staggering, especially during his final exile in London, where he lived from 1849 until he died.
He wasn't living in some grand thinker's estate.
Not at all. He lived for years in a tiny, squalid, two-room flat in London's Soho district.
The poverty he endured in London is difficult to overstate. He and his wife, Jenny, lived in absolute squalor. They were constantly hounded by creditors.
And most tragically, they lost 3 of their young children, Guido, Franziska, and Edgar, to diseases that were entirely exacerbated by their terrible living conditions.
Through all of this grief, Marx would walk to the reading room of the British Museum every single day, spending 10 to 12 hours poring over dense economic texts, trying to crack the code of capitalism.
It's just wild to think about the juxtaposition. The man who is actively writing the most comprehensive, sweeping critique of global capital ever conceived was frequently pawning his own winter coat just to buy paper to write on.
He couldn't leave the house on certain days because his only trousers were at the pawn shop.
It's unbelievable.
This immense personal suffering and his immersion in the brutal, smoke-choked realities of 19th century industrial London deeply informed the profound urgency and the relentless analytical rigor of his work. He wasn't just analyzing an abstract system.
He was analyzing the system that he felt was physically destroying his family and millions of others.
Exactly.
Okay, let's unpack this. How did he move from being a frustrated, grieving journalist and exiled radical to formulating a completely new theory of human history?
This brings us to a massive philosophical breakthrough he had just before his London exile. He essentially took the most famous philosopher of his day, Hegel, and violently turned his theories upside down.
To understand that intellectual leap, we have to look at how educated people viewed history at the time. The prevailing Enlightenment view was that history was fundamentally driven by ideas.
Right. Thinkers believed that the gradual, triumphant advance of the spirit of liberty, or the evolution of human rationality, was the mainspring of human progress. We get smarter, our ideas get better, and society improves.
And you also had Thomas Carlyle's great man theory, which was very popular. That's the idea that history is nothing but the biography of great men. Princes, kings, generals shaping the world through sheer force of will. Napoleon decides to march across Europe, and history changes.
Exactly. But then there was Hegel. Hegel argued that society doesn't just change randomly because a king wakes up in a bad mood, and it doesn't just smoothly progress in a straight line.
He argued it changes through a process called dialectics.
Yes. Basically, this is the idea that any given society contains deep internal contradictions, a clash of opposing forces. You have a dominant idea or system, which you call the thesis. That system naturally generates its own opposition, the antithesis.
And these two forces clash, and the resolution of that conflict creates a new, higher state of society, the synthesis.
It's like a constant evolutionary friction. But Hegel believed this whole process was essentially the evolution of an abstract world spirit, or a collective human consciousness coming to realize true freedom. It was all taking place in the realm of the mind. It was very idea-focused.
Marx loved Hegel's dialectical method. He loved the idea of interconnectedness and the concept that change only happens through internal contradiction and conflict.
But he completely and utterly rejected Hegel's idealism. Marx famously wrote that Hegel was standing on his head and needed to be turned right side up.
Meaning, for Marx, history is absolutely not driven by abstract ideas or the world spirit or the speeches of kings. It is driven by the stark material conditions of production.
Precisely. Driven by how we survive. Before humans can write poetry, debate philosophy, or invent religions, they must eat, drink, find shelter, and clothe themselves.
Therefore, the most fundamental act of history is the production of material life. You have to look at how humans actually labor to meet their physical needs. This is the bedrock foundation of what is called historical materialism.
There's a great analogy used to explain this. Human history is like a massive river. On the surface, if you just look at the water, it looks the same day after day. But underneath, The current is constantly flowing, eroding the banks, changing the channel, shifting the sediment.
And eventually, the banks weaken so much that a flood comes and the river violently bursts out and takes a completely new course.
That's Marx's view of history. The speeches of politicians are just the ripples on the surface. The deep current eroding the banks is the technology we use to make things, and how we organize ourselves to use that technology.
Which leads us directly to Marx's fundamental structural model of society, which is absolutely vital to everything else he wrote, the concept of the base and the superstructure.
This is a crucial framework.
So if I'm picturing a building, the base is the foundation. What exactly makes up the economic base of society?
The economic base consists of two distinct elements. First, you have the forces of production. This is the physical stuff, the level of technology, the tools, the factories, the raw materials, and the human labor power and skills available at that time in history.
Okay, the physical capacity to make things.
Yes. And second, you have the relations of production. These are the social structures on property relations that dictate how those forces are used. It's the relationship between the people who own the tools and the people who do the work.
The relationship between an owner and a wage worker, or a feudal lord and a serf, or an ancient master and a slave.
Exactly.
Yep.
So the base is essentially how we make stuff and who legally owns the stuff we use to make it.
If that's the foundation, what is the superstructure built on top of it?
The superstructure is quite literally everything else in human society. It includes the political system, the legal framework, the state apparatus, religion, art, morality, and even philosophy.
And Marx argued that the economic base ultimately determines or heavily conditions the shape of the superstructure, right?
He did. The legal and political institutions don't just exist neutrally. They are built specifically to stabilize, reflect, and reproduce the existing economic relations of the base.
Wait, so instead of the laws shaping the economy shapes the laws.
Yes.
If the base is the factory and the assembly line, I'm guessing the superstructure is the boss's mansion.
Not quite the physical mansion itself, but the laws that protect that mansion. The superstructure is the police force that will arrest you if you try to take the mansion.
Ah, I see.
It's the cultural ideology that tells you the boss deserves the mansion because he worked harder. Marx made a very profound assertion here. He argued that the ruling ideas of any epoch are simply the ideas of the ruling class.
Because if the ruling class controls the material base, they own the factories, the land, the banks, they naturally also control the superstructure.
What's fascinating here is how seamless it becomes. They fund the politicians, they own the media, they influence the universities, they shape the culture to justify their own dominant position and make the current economic system seem like the natural, eternal order of the universe, rather than just a temporary historical phase.
They make the current setup feel like common sense.
Exactly. And historical materialism explains how change actually happens within this model. The forces of production, human technology, and our capacity to make things are dynamic. They're constantly developing.
We invent the steam engine, then the microchip, then AI.
Right. But the relations of production, the property laws, and the class structures are rigid. They want to stay exactly as they are.
So the river starts eroding the banks.
Yes. Eventually, the new productive forces completely outgrow the old relations of production. The old laws and structures become fetters. They become chains holding back human progress.
And when that internal contradiction becomes too massive to contain, you get an era of social revolution. The old relations are violently torn apart to make way for new relations that actually fit the new technology.
The texts outline the distinct, broad stages of history that Marx identified using this specific lens.
It starts way back with primitive communism, right? These were early hunter-gatherer societies where resources were shared communally out of necessity. There were no distinct economic classes because there was no surplus wealth. Everyone was just barely surviving.
But then, as agriculture develops, humans figure out how to produce a surplus. Suddenly, someone can hoard the grain. This leads to the first class-based societies, slave societies, like ancient Rome or Greece, which are defined by the stark contradiction between master and slaves. The master owns the means of production and the worker.
Which then, over centuries, evolves into feudalism, characterized by the conflict between lords and serfs.
And note how the superstructure works there. The brutal economic reality of feudal land ownership wasn't justified by economic textbooks. It was justified by the superstructure through the religious idea of the divine right of kings.
Huh?
The peasants were told God wanted them to be poor and the king to be rich.
But eventually, the productive forces of early industry, the discovery of the Americas, and global trade completely outgrew the rigid, localized guild systems and land restrictions of feudalism.
The new rising merchant class, the bourgeoisie, needed free trade and mobile labor. So they overthrew the feudal lords in events like the French Revolution, leading to the current historical stage capitalism.
Which is defined by the conflict between the bourgeoisie, who own the capital and the factories, and the proletariat, the working class, who own nothing but their ability to work.
That is the massive, sweeping view of human history Marx laid out. It covers thousands of years in a few logical steps.
But how does this broad, bird's-eye historical lens focus down to the individual? If I'm a worker, how does capitalism actually operate on the factory floor according to this theory?
That brings us to Marx's anatomy of exploitation and some of his most famous psychological insights. To understand the individual experience under capitalism, we have to look closely at his early writings, specifically the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844.
Here he introduces the foundational concept of alienation.
Or Entfremdung in German. Marx argued that under capitalism, the worker experiences four specific, debilitating types of alienation.
Let's try to relate these to things people might actually experience today, because reading 19th century philosophy can feel a bit disconnected. Let's say you work in a giant, windowless corporate office. First, Marx says you face alienation from the product of your labor.
Meaning you might spend all day coding a piece of software or assembling a phone, but you don't own it. The moment it leaves your hands, it belongs to the capitalist. You are pouring your energy into an object that is immediately taken from you.
Second, you experience alienation from the process of production itself. You have no real say in how the work is done. It's often repetitive, coercive, and dictated from above by management or an algorithm.
You aren't working to fulfill a creative drive. You are working because you will starve or lose your housing if you don't. You become, as he put it, just an appendage of the machine.
The third type is where it gets highly philosophical alienation from what Marx called species being. What exactly did he mean by that?
Species being essentially refers to our fundamental human essence. Marx believed that what separates humans from animals is our ability to freely, consciously, and creatively shape the world around us. We build things just to make them beautiful.
But under capitalism, your life's creative energy is reduced to a mere commodity.
Yes. You sell the best hours of your day, your physical and mental energy, just to secure the basic physical means of survival. Work becomes a miserable chore rather than a meaningful expression of who you are. You only feel truly yourself outside of work when you are eating, drinking, or resting, the very things we share with animals.
Marx is basically describing that awful feeling of sending 100 meaningless emails a day in a cubicle, looking at the clock and realizing you have no idea what your company actually produces or why it matters.
That's alienation from species being, exactly.
And finally, the fourth type is alienation from other humans. Instead of viewing work as a grand, cooperative human endeavor, the system forces you to view your coworkers as direct competitors for scarce jobs, raises, and promotions.
And you inherently view the capitalist, the boss, as an antagonist who is trying to squeeze as much out of you as possible. It is a deeply bleak picture of the psychological toll that the economic system extracts from the individual.
But Marx wasn't just a philosopher of feelings and psychology. He wanted to prove his theories scientifically.
He did. He dove deep into the complex math and mechanics of classical economics. This leads us directly into the labor theory of value, which is the absolute, unquestionable bedrock of his massive economic analysis in Das Kapital.
Okay, so if alienation is the emotional side, the labor theory of value is the mathematical side. What is it?
The labor theory of value proposes that the economic value of any commodity is determined by the socially necessary labor time required to produce it.
Now, it's not just any labor, right? If you spend 100 hours clumsily whittling a wooden chair that a highly skilled carpenter makes perfectly in 1 hour, your chair isn't magically worth 100 times more just because you took longer.
Right, the market doesn't care if you're bad at your job. It's the average time required by society, given the current normal level of technology, skill, and intensity of labor.
So if society on average takes 2 hours to make a pair of shoes, the value of those shoes is 2 hours of socially necessary labor.
And here is where Marx makes a crucial distinction that solved what he saw as the greatest, most confounding mystery of political economy. Where does profit actually come from?
Because the classical economists couldn't figure it out. If the market is perfectly fair and everyone pays exactly what things are worth, how does anyone get rich?
This is the crux of Marx's theory of surplus value. To explain this, Marx looked at the formula for capital, which he wrote as MCM prime. That stands for money, commodity, more money.
Let's use a modern narrative example to make this concrete, rather than just reading algebra. Let's say I want to start a business. I take $1,000 of my savings. That's money. I buy a 3D printer for $500 and $400 worth of raw plastic filament. Those are the commodities.
Okay, you have your capital invested.
Then I hire a worker for the day for $100. At the end of the day, I take the plastic widgets we printed and sell them for $1,200, more money. I made a $200 profit. The mystery is, where did that extra $200 come from?
Exactly. It didn't come from the plastic. The plastic just transferred its $400 value into the widgets. It didn't come from the 3D printer. The printer just transferred a tiny bit of its wear and tear value into the widgets.
If all commodities trade at their true fair value in an open market, new value shouldn't magically appear out of thin air. So how does Marx solve it?
Marx's answer is that the capitalist doesn't buy the worker's labor, meaning the actual physical work done to make the widgets. The capitalist buys the worker's labor power.
Labor power.
Yes. Which is their mere capacity to work for a set period of time, like an 8-hour shift. And like any commodity in the market, labor power has an exchange value.
How do you determine the value of a human being's capacity to work?
Same way you determine the value of anything else, the cost to produce it. The value of labor power is the cost of keeping the worker alive and functioning so they can come back to work the next day.
It's the cost of their food, their clothing, their shelter, and raising the next generation of workers. So the capitalist pays the worker a wage that is roughly equal to the exchange value of their labor power, just enough to survive.
Yes. But here is the secret of capitalism. The unique, magical use value of human labor power is that it can create more value in a day than it costs to reproduce itself. Going back to your 3D printer example, the worker might produce enough widgets to cover their $100 daily wage in just 4 hours.
But I bought their labor power for the whole 8-hour day.
Exactly. So for the remaining 4 hours of the shift, the worker is still laboring, still creating value, but they have already earned their keep. Those final 4 hours create new value that the capitalist simply takes for free. Marx called that unpaid, excess value, surplus value.
And this is entirely where profit comes from. The capitalist legally appropriates this unpaid labor.
And it's vital to note, because people always get this wrong, that for Marx, this is the strict mathematical economic definition of exploitation.
It's not necessarily a moral judgment about having a mean, greedy boss. It doesn't matter if the boss gives you free snacks and a ping pong table, the system structurally demands this extraction of unpaid labor, or the capitalists won't make a profit and they will eventually go bankrupt.
It is the inescapable engine of the system. Now, this theoretical framework did face massive challenges, which the academic sources detail extensively.
Like the reduction problem, right?
Yes. If value is just time, how do you calculate the value of highly skilled labor versus unskilled labor? An hour of brain surgery isn't the same as an hour of sweeping floors.
How did Marx deal with that?
He argued that skilled labor is essentially a multiple of unskilled labor. You have to account for the socially necessary time it took the worker and society to learn that complex skill years of medical school, training, equipment. It's condensed labor.
And then there's an even bigger headache for economists called the transformation problem.
This is a dense one.
If value is only created by human labor, then logic dictates that highly labor-intensive industries like hand-picking strawberries should be vastly more profitable than highly mechanized industries like an automated car factory. But in the real world, that isn't true.
Right. Profit rates tend to average out across all different types of industries. How do labor values transform into the actual prices of production we see on the shelf?
How did he reconcile that?
Marx addressed this in the later volumes of Das Kapital by arguing that capital is highly mobile. Capitalists are like sharks seeking blood, they chase the highest profit.
If one sector is highly profitable because it uses lots of labor, competing capitalists will rush their money into that sector, building new businesses. This increases the supply of the product, which drives down prices, and therefore drives down profits.
Conversely, if a mechanized sector is less profitable, capital flees that sector, supply drops, prices rise, and profits recover.
It's an equalizing effect.
Through this ruthless competitive mobility, all the surplus value extracted across the entire economy is essentially pooled together and redistributed, creating a general average rate of profit.
Marx argued that the total value in the economy still strictly equals the total labor time, But individual commodities sell at prices of production that reflect this average profit, rather than reflecting their strict, isolated labor value.
Here's where it gets really interesting. How does Marx make the massive leap from your bad day at work to predicting the inevitable collapse of the entire global economic system?
This brings us to what he called the laws of motion of capitalism. He believed he had discovered the actual physics of how the economy moves over time.
He predicted that the very mechanisms that make capitalism so incredibly dynamic, innovative, and productive are the exact same mechanisms that will fatally cause its self-destruction.
The first law of motion is the absolute, unyielding compulsion to accumulate. As Marx wrote in Das Kapital, accumulate, accumulate. That is Moses and the prophets.
Why can't a business owner just be happy making $1 million a year, go buy a yacht, and relax? Why the relentless drive for more?
Because of the nature of competition, capitalists are locked in a brutal anonymous war with each other. If you make $1 million and just relax, your competitor will take their $1 million and reinvest it.
They will buy faster machines, figure out how to produce goods cheaper, and undercut your prices.
If you don't constantly reinvest your surplus value into expanding your business and ruthlessly cutting costs, you will be destroyed by the market. You will be driven into bankruptcy and forced down into the working class yourself.
It's an adapt or die scenario. And this relentless competition drives the second law, the tendency toward constant technological revolution.
To beat the competition, you absolutely have to produce goods cheaper. To do that, you invest heavily in labor-saving machinery. You replace 10 workers with one massive machine.
Which naturally leads to the centralization of capital, where the big fish eat the little fish, small businesses are wiped out, and the global economy becomes dominated by massive, towering monopolies.
But this technological arms race creates a fatal, inescapable mathematical contradiction. Marx called it the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, or the TRPF. Let's break down the mechanics here.
Marx divided a capitalist's total investment into two parts. Constant capital, which is the money spent on dead machinery, buildings, and raw materials. And variable capital, which is the money spent on wages for living workers.
Right, and remember the golden rule from the labor theory of value-only living labor, the variable capital, can create new surplus value.
Machines just slowly transfer their existing value into the product as they wear down.
Right.
A machine cannot be exploited beyond its fixed value.
Precisely. Now, imagine you own a bakery. Initially, you employ 50 bakers. You extract a little surplus value from each of them, and your profit is high compared to your initial investment. But your competitor buys an automated bread-making machine. You have to buy one too.
You fire 45 bakers and spend a massive fortune on this huge machine.
And I'm producing way more bread now.
You are.
Yeah.
But the ratio of your investment has drastically changed. The ratio of constant capital to variable capital, what Marx called the organic composition of capital, has skyrocketed.
Because the relative proportion of living labor you employ is shrinking dramatically compared to your massive sunk investment in technology.
So the overall rate of your profit relative to your total investment eventually has to decline. You are squeezing out more total bread, but your profit margin per dollar invested gets squeezed tighter and tighter by the sheer staggering cost of the technology race.
And this profit squeeze leads directly to the inevitability of economic crises. Now, I want to highlight something from the sources here because it completely blew my mind. Before capitalism in feudal societies, a crisis was usually a crisis of underproduction. A drought hits the crops, there's no wheat, people starve. It's a crisis of scarcity.
But Marx pointed out that capitalist crises are bizarrely unique in human history. They are crises of overproduction.
It is an absolute absurdity of the system. Wait, how can an economy crash because we have too much stuff? That seems completely backwards.
That's exactly what I thought when reviewing the texts. Well, the technological revolution creates a literal mountain of commodities. Factories are churning out cars, clothes, and phones at unprecedented speeds.
But remember, the capitalists are constantly trying to cut costs to survive competition. How do they cut costs? They keep wages as low as possible, and they replace workers with machines.
So you have massive automated factories producing infinite goods, but the working class, who are the primary consumers, have been fired or have had their wages suppressed.
Exactly. They don't have the purchasing power to buy the mountain of goods they just produced. The system chokes on its own immense productivity.
The market is flooded with goods that no one can afford to buy. Goods sit rotting in warehouses, factories are forced to close down, even more workers are fired, and the economy spirals into a devastating depression.
People are starving and homeless, not because society didn't produce enough food and housing, but because there's too much food and housing that cannot be sold for a profit.
It's a completely man-made disaster. And to manage this chaotic cycle, capitalism requires what Marx called the industrial reserve army of labor.
Yes. This is the permanent pool of unemployed workers, migrating laborers, and marginalized groups. The system structurally needs unemployment to function. It is a feature, not a bug.
Which goes against everything politicians say today about striving for zero unemployment. Why does the system need people to be jobless?
If everyone had a job, the labor market would be incredibly tight. Workers would have immense leverage. They could demand higher and higher wages, which would eat directly into the capitalists' profits.
The reserve army acts as a constant, heavy downward pressure on wages. The implicit threat is always there if you demand a raise or complain about safety. There are 10 starving people outside the factory gates willing to take your job for less money.
The existence of the unemployed keeps the employed workers docile and cheap.
The sources also highlight how Marx expanded his massive theoretical framework to cover other complex economic phenomena, like rent and money. He distinguished between differential rent and absolute rent.
For instance, the contemporary analyses apply his theory of rent perfectly to the 1970s OPEC oil crisis.
The OPEC example is a great modern application because there is a structural geological scarcity of oil. The owners of the cheapest, most easily extracted wells say, those in the Middle East reap massive monopoly surplus profits, which Marx called rent.
They get this not because they labored harder, but because the global market price of oil is dictated by the cost of extracting it from the most difficult, expensive marginal wells in the world. The owners of the easy wells just pocket the massive difference.
And on money, he held a commodity theory of money, essentially arguing that paper money inflation happens when governments issue too many paper notes relative to the actual gold standard or the hard value backing them.
It's an incredibly comprehensive, almost obsessive system attempting to logically explain every single facet of the global economy.
If we connect this dense economic theory back to the bigger picture, all of this heavy lifting in Das Kapital wasn't just an academic exercise for Marx. He wasn't just trying to win a Nobel Prize in economics.
For Marx, understanding the hidden mechanics of exploitation and proving the inevitable mathematical crises of capitalism was the necessary scientific foundation for real-world, violent political activism.
He famously stated that philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. He believed theory had to serve the revolution.
Which brings us to the political side of his life, and perhaps the most famous political pamphlet in human history. In 1847, an underground radical organization called the Communist League commissioned Marx and Engels to write a definitive program explaining their views.
In 1848, a year when revolutions were sweeping across Europe, they published the Manifesto of the Communist Party.
The Manifesto is a truly fascinating, explosive document. What is often completely overlooked by people who only know the title is how much Marx actually praises the bourgeoisie, the capitalist class, in the early pages of the text.
He praises them. I thought they were the ultimate villains of his story.
He describes them as a historically revolutionary force. He writes with almost awestruck admiration about how the bourgeoisie pitilessly tore apart the old, static, superstitious feudal ties.
He praises them for constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production, building massive cities, and connecting the entire globe through commerce and trade. He acknowledges that capitalism created more massive and colossal productive forces than all preceding generations combined.
But the twist is that by doing all of this incredible building, the bourgeoisie inadvertently created the very weapons that will eventually destroy them.
And more importantly, they called into existence the people who will wield those weapons, the modern proletariat, the industrial working class.
The Manifesto famously argues that capitalism essentially produces its own gravediggers. By cramming thousands of exploited workers together into massive factories, capitalism forces them to socialize, communicate, and realize their shared class interests.
And beyond the fiery rhetoric, the text outlines a specific 10-point transitional plan that Marx and Engels believed should be implemented immediately after a successful proletarian revolution in an advanced country.
These weren't immediate jumps to a magical, stateless utopia. They were practical, harsh measures designed to centralize economic power in the hands of the state and aggressively break bourgeois property relations.
Looking at these 10 points today is absolutely wild. When you read the list, some of them still sound incredibly radical, but others have just become completely normal, boring parts of modern society.
He called for a heavy progressive or graduated income tax. He demanded the absolute abolition of all rights of inheritance to stop generational wealth hoarding. He wanted the centralization of credit in a national bank and total state control of all transport and communication.
And then you have the points that became mainstream.
Right. Point number 10 is literally just calling for the abolition of child factory labor and the establishment of free public education for all children.
It's profound to realize that in 1848, the idea of the government providing free elementary school to every child was considered a radical, dangerous Marxist demand that threatened to destroy civilization. Today, it's a basic tenet of almost every modern nation.
To put these radical ideas into international practice, Marx couldn't just write pamphlets. He became deeply personally involved in the founding of the International Workingmen's Association in London in 1864, which became better known as the First International.
However, reading through the historical encyclopedias covering this period, the First International was absolutely not a unified, happy brotherhood of workers.
It was a chaotic mess. It was immediately consumed by intense, bitter, internal ideological battles. It was a massive clash of massive egos.
You had Marx on one side, fiercely arguing that the working class needed to conquer political power. He believed they needed to form political parties, win elections where possible, or launch revolutions, and then use a powerful transitional state apparatus, the dictatorship of the proletariat, to forcefully dismantle the capitalist system.
But on the other side, you had the anarchists, led by the charismatic Russian revolutionary Mikhail Bakunin. Bakunin completely rejected Marx's idea of a transitional state.
Bakunin argued that any state, even if you call it a worker state, relies on authority and violence, and would inevitably become a new tyranny. The workers who took power would just become the new ruling class.
Bakunin demanded the immediate, total abolition of the state alongside capitalism.
And it wasn't just Bakunin. You also had the Proudhonists, or mutualists, primarily from France. They opposed strikes, they opposed violent revolution, and they opposed political action altogether.
They preferred a slow, peaceful system of building independent worker cooperatives and alternative credit systems to just outcompete capitalism.
These tensions finally boiled over and exploded at the Hague Congress in 1872, leading to a bitter, permanent split between the Marxists and the anarchists.
And the dramatic backdrop to this entire split was the Paris Commune of 1871.
The Paris Commune was a watershed moment in socialist history. Following France's defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, radical workers in the National Guard actually rose up, took over the city of Paris, and ran it themselves for a brief couple of months.
Marx watched this unfold from London and declared it a glorious harbinger of a new society. It was the first time he saw what his theoretical dictatorship of the proletariat might actually look like in messy, real-world practice.
They abolished the police, they separated church and state, they handed abandoned factories over to worker cooperatives.
But the Commune was brutally, mercilessly suppressed by the French military. Thousands of workers were massacred in the streets during the Bloody Week.
The resulting trauma and fallout from that massacre deeply exacerbated the internal conflicts over tactics that finally destroyed the First International.
So, what does this all mean? We've covered his life, his theories, and his politics, but what does this all mean for the world that came after him?
We have a 19th century thinker operating in the specific context of Victorian choked factories and Prussian government censorship, whose ideas caused massive seismic shifts that lasted long after his death in 1883.
To understand the full, terrifying scope of his work, we have to look at the 20th and 21st century reverberations, the political adaptations, and the incredibly fierce intellectual critiques of his theories.
Let's start with how his ideas mutated in the 20th century. Because the actual political movements that took his name and seized state power often looked completely different from what he originally described or predicted.
Marx thought the socialist revolution would inevitably happen in the most advanced, highly industrialized capitalist nations, places like England or Germany.
He thought it required a country where the working class was huge, literate, and highly organized, and where capitalism had already built massive productive wealth.
But that's absolutely not what happened. The revolutions didn't happen in London or Berlin.
No. The most significant world-altering adaptations occurred in largely agrarian, unindustrialized, peasant-majority nations. Vladimir Lenin adapted Marx's theories for the specific conditions of Russia, creating what became known as Leninism.
Lenin looked at the Russian workers and argued that the working class on its own would only ever develop what he called trade union consciousness. Left to their own devices, they would just strike to ask for an extra dollar an hour or shorter shifts. They wouldn't spontaneously demand the overthrow of the state.
So how do you get a revolution if the workers just want a raise?
Lenin argued that you needed a vanguard party. This would be a small, highly disciplined, ruthless organization of professional revolutionaries who truly understood Marxist theory. This vanguard would lead the masses, seize the state apparatus through force, and then use the state to artificially speed up industrialization.
And then in China, Mao Zedong took Lenin's adaptation and mutated it even further. Maoism shifted the entire focus of the revolution away from the urban factory workers completely.
Mao realized that in China, the urban proletariat was tiny. The true revolutionary engine in China was the massive, impoverished, rural peasant class.
He also introduced the concept of continuous revolution, the paranoid but perhaps structurally accurate idea that class struggle continues even after the Communist Party takes power, because the new party bureaucracy will naturally try to solidify itself as a new ruling class.
Therefore, society must be constantly agitated and purged.
Meanwhile, back in Western Europe, where Marx predicted the revolution would start, the expected uprisings failed to materialize or were easily crushed. The workers largely rallied behind their national flags during World War I instead of uniting across borders.
This profound failure led to the rise of what academics call Western Marxism, featuring brilliant thinkers like Antonio Gramsci, Georg Lukács, and later the Frankfurt School.
They had to be scratching their heads. They had to ask, if capitalism is so inherently mathematically contradictory like Marx proved, why hasn't it collapsed? Why aren't the workers revolting?
To answer that agonizing question, they shifted their analytical focus entirely away from the economic base, the factories, and the TRPF math, and started looking really, really closely at the superstructure, culture, media, religion, and education.
Gramsci, writing from a fascist prison cell in Italy, developed the theory of hegemony. He explained how the ruling class maintains power not primarily by pointing guns at people, but by controlling the cultural narrative so thoroughly and from such an early age that their capitalist values become the unquestioned common sense of society.
The workers don't revolt because they literally can't imagine an alternative.
Precisely. Lukács introduced the concept of reification, expanding on alienation. He argued that social relationships under capitalism become so deeply warped by market logic that people begin to view each other, and even themselves, merely as objects or commodities to be bought, sold, or optimized.
And then you have the Frankfurt School, with thinkers like Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer, who developed the massive critique of the culture industry.
They looked at the rise of mass media, radio, standardized pop music, and Hollywood blockbusters. They argued that this mass culture acts as a kind of ideological pacifier. By pumping out endless, easily digestible, standardized entertainment, the culture industry keeps the working class exhausted, distracted, and completely incapable of realizing their alienated state.
So basically, keeping people hooked on standardized pop music and reality TV stops the revolution.
That's a simplified but accurate summation of their argument. Mass culture creates false psychological needs that can only be met by buying more capitalist products.
But alongside these Marxist adaptations came severe, foundational, and often devastating critiques of Marx's entire theoretical system from the outside. The sources detail several major ones that completely altered economic thought.
Let's dive into those critiques. From the economic side, you have the Austrian School of Economics, which fundamentally attacked Marx's core premise, the labor theory of value. If the foundation crumbles, the whole house falls.
Exactly. Thinkers like Eugen von Bombauer argued that economic value has absolutely nothing to do with how much human labor goes into a product. They argued that value is entirely subjective. It's based on what they called marginal utility.
The classic example is a glass of water. A glass of water is incredibly life-savingly valuable if you are dying of thirst in the middle of the Sahara Desert. But that exact same glass of water is practically worthless if you're standing knee-deep at a fresh, flowing river.
The amount of labor it took to get the water hasn't changed, but its value fluctuates wildly based on the subjective need of the consumer at that specific moment.
And the implications of that critique are massive for Marxist theory. If the labor theory of value falls, then Marx's mathematical proof of surplus value completely collapses.
If value isn't purely derived from labor time, then profit isn't mathematically proven to be stolen, unpaid labor. It might simply be the reward for the capitalist taking a risk, organizing the resources, or deferring their own consumption.
Moving beyond economics, sociologists like Max Weber and Ralph Dahrendorf viciously attacked Marx's prediction of social polarization. Marx predicted that as capitalism advanced, society would split cleanly and brutally into two distinct camps, a tiny handful of ultra-rich bourgeoisie and a massive, universally impoverished proletariat.
But the 20th century saw the exact opposite happen in the West. It saw the massive, unprecedented expansion of the middle class.
The rise of complex corporate bureaucracies created millions of jobs for middle managers, professionals, administrators, and white-collar workers. These people didn't own the factories, but they also weren't starving proletarians. They had pensions, homes, and stock portfolios.
This completely blurred the stark lines of the class struggle Marx confidently predicted.
And philosophically, titans of the 20th century like Karl Popper and Friedrich Hayek aggressively attacked Marx's reliance on historical determinism. They found his claim that history operates according to inescapable scientific laws to be incredibly dangerous.
They argued that claiming, the predetermined end goal of human history completely ignores human free will and agency.
Furthermore, Hayek argued that any attempt to actually implement Marx's vision to centrally plan an entire complex economy without the signaling mechanism of free market prices inevitably, unavoidably requires immense coercive force.
If the state has to dictate what is produced and who gets it, the state must have absolute power over individuals. They argued that Marxist theory leads directly and inevitably to authoritarianism and totalitarianism, as seen in the Soviet Union.
And here we must remind you of our impartial stance. We are examining how these theories and counter-theories shaped global history without taking a side.
The cultural critic Walter Benjamin perfectly encapsulated this deep unease with Marx's claims of scientific certainty in an essay he wrote in 1940. He used an incredible analogy. He compared Marx's historical materialism to the Turk.
The Turk was a famous 18th century fake automaton. It was a mechanical doll dressed in robes that supposedly played chess scientifically, moving pieces with gears and levers and beating human challengers.
But it was a trick. Secretly hidden inside the cabinet under the board was a human dwarf, a master chess player who actually pulled the strings and manipulated the machine.
Benjamin suggested that Marxist theory was exactly like the Turk. It presented itself to the world as a pure, objective, inevitable science of history. But secretly, hidden inside, it relied on an ugly theology of absolute historical destiny to guarantee its victory. It was a faith disguised as an equation.
Even Friedrich Engels, toward the end of his life, saw the immense danger of how their theories were being aggressively simplified and weaponized. The sources show Engels writing letters, desperately warning his own followers not to use historical materialism as a lazy excuse to avoid actually doing the hard work of studying history.
He explicitly, forcefully stated that the economic element is not the only determining factor in how society evolves, and he scolded younger, zealous Marxists for twisting their complex, nuanced ideas into meaningless, abstract catchphrases used to bludgeon their opponents.
It's the classic case of the founder losing control of the movement. Yet, despite the catastrophic failures of state socialism in the 20th century, and despite these profound foundational critiques from brilliant economists and philosophers, Marxist theories refuse to die. They continue to find vibrant, urgent application in the 21st century.
Because capitalism still experiences crises. Scholars point directly to the 2007 to 2008 global financial crisis as a prime modern example of Marx's theory of the overaccumulation of capital.
The Marxist analysis of 2008 argues that because profitable investments in the real physical economy of making things were shrinking due to the falling rate of profit, desperate capital flooded into speculative, fictitious capital like complex derivatives and subprime mortgages.
The system created massive, illusory bubbles of debt to keep accumulating, which inevitably, spectacularly burst, nearly bringing down the global economy.
You also see his ideas heavily applied to the modern gig economy. When you look at an Uber driver, a DoorDash courier, or a freelance digital worker, contemporary sociologists apply Marx's concept of alienation to show how these modern workers are completely isolated.
They are stripped of all job security, denied benefits, and pitted mercilessly against each other by opaque black box algorithms designed by tech monopolies to extract the absolute maximum surplus value from every second of their time.
Finally, there is the rapidly growing academic field of ecological Marxism. This field uses Marx's concept of the metabolic rift, his observation that capitalist agriculture was extracting nutrients from the soil faster than they could be naturally replenished to examine the current global climate crisis.
They extrapolate this to a planetary scale, examining the terrifying collision course between capitalism's fundamental structural need for infinite, compounding growth, and the stark, finite material limits of the Earth's natural resources and biosphere. They argue that the core drive to relentlessly accumulate is fundamentally incompatible with ecological survival.
It has been an absolutely massive intellectual journey today. We started with Marx as a rebellious, poetry-writing youth getting into duels in Bonn. We followed him through the political crackdowns in Prussia, to the crushing, tragic poverty of his London exile, where he spent decades freezing in the British Museum pinning Das Kapital.
We navigated the incredibly dense mechanics of the labor theory of value, surplus value, and the base and superstructure. We traced the intense, bloody ideological wars of the 19th and 20th centuries right up to the gig economy algorithms and climate change debates happening on our phones today.
The immense breadth of the source material we covered reveals a thinker who attempted nothing less than a unified, total theory of human, social, and economic evolution. Whether you view him as a groundbreaking, peerless diagnostic genius who uncovered the hidden matrix of capitalism, or as a dangerously flawed prophet whose ideas led to historical catastrophes, the analytical framework he constructed remains an absolutely central, unavoidable pillar for understanding the architecture of the modern world.
And as we finally wrap up this custom deep dive, we want to leave you with one final, lingering idea to mull over on your own.
It builds on everything we've discussed, but applies it to the very strange future we're walking into. As we saw in the sources, Marx firmly believed that capitalism creates its own gravediggers. His entire theory of revolution relied heavily on the physical, geographical reality that by forcing thousands of workers into massive, brutal physical factories, capitalism was inadvertently socializing labor.
It was physically grouping people together on the assembly line, forcing them to cooperate, which would inevitably foster deep class consciousness and political unity.
But consider the modern world right now. As the physical factory floor is increasingly being replaced by decentralized, remote, work-from-home setups, and as millions of people are absorbed into algorithmic, app-based gig work where they never meet a coworker, the workforce is becoming physically isolated and atomized once again.
If physical proximity on the factory floor was the historical incubator for the working class unity that Marx predicted would change the world, how does the extreme physical-digital isolation of the modern worker fundamentally change the formula for societal transformation?
If we are all just avatars on a screen, how do the gravediggers ever meet? Keep questioning the hidden structures of the world around you. Thank you for joining us on this incredibly deep dive into the source material.
Recuerda que estamos en TikTok, Instagram y YouTube.